It's now my pleasure to introduce the Reverend Canon Brian Cox. I love saying that, Reverend Canon. Doesn't that kind of instill this sense? But Brian, I'll call him Brian because Brian is a very close personal friend, and he and I worked together on the Patches Project on faith-based diplomacy, and it was, just to correct Fareed, it was the Patches Project that won the 2011 Peacemaker Award, not me personally. So, and Brian is co-founder and director of that, as I am with our colleague Tim Pownell. But Brian is an Episcopal priest, but not like any priest that you've ever come across before. Not to say he is anything less than a wonderful Episcopal priest, but he is very much more than that. He's about the savviest, most politically astute, and internationally experienced priest that you'll ever want to meet. He is also Senior Vice President of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy in Washington, D.C. As I said, Brian co-founded and directs the Patches Project on faith-based diplomacy, which is a joint effort of Pepperdine and ICRD. He's also an adjunct professor at Pepperdine and teaches a course on faith-based diplomacy. Brian has dedicated the last 20-plus years of his life to the design and pursuit of a unique faith-based peacemaking effort, which he has applied in some of the most contentious and bloody disputes in the world, including the Balkans, Kashmir, and the Middle East. He was the recipient of the 2006 Mahatma Gandhi Award in India in recognition of his peacemaking efforts in Kashmir. He's the author of 2 books on this subject of faith-based reconciliation that are now being translated into Arabic and Hebrew. Brian just returned last night at midnight from a grueling yet highly productive peacemaking trip to the Middle East. So watch him closely to make sure he stays awake. I've been watching him through the corner of my eye. And in order to ensure that he's at least awake for the beginning of his remarks, can you join me in giving him a warm, loud welcome?
I promise to stay awake for my own remarks. If you want to sleep, that's okay, but I'll try to stay awake. I'd like to basically make 2 points tonight as I speak in the short time that I have. One is I'd like to make the point that religious extremism is not always what it appears on the surface. And second, the answer to religious extremism is not what you think. So first, let me look at the whole area that religious extremism is not always what appears on the surface. Notre Dame historian Scott Appleby, who directs the Kroc Institute, defines religious extremism as the civic or violent intolerance toward the other or the outsider. Diana Eck talks about 3 basic orientations that we can have toward other religious traditions. One is the exclusivist orientation, where we look at our own tradition and say, I'm right, the other is wrong, and they're probably evil on top of it. Then there's the inclusivist that says, you know, truth is something that can be apprehended from many different directions, and I honor people's sincere search for truth in other traditions. But at the end of the day, I still believe that my understanding of truth is the best and highest. And then there's the pluralist who says that basically that there's no one particular tradition that has any corner on the truth, and all are equally valid in terms of the search for truth. And as you think about yourself tonight, you might want to think about where do you stand in terms of that framework. Now, I speak as someone from the Christian tradition. I'm an Anglican. And typically when one thinks about religious extremism in the Christian tradition, one immediately thinks about some of the public perceptions of that, of things like the conservative evangelical of the right wing, and you can, if you want to, add a caveat, Tea Party folk. You might think about people who tend to be strong supporters of the State of Israel. They are often called Christian Zionists, or Christians who are strong pro-life supporters, even to the extent of being anti-abortion in terms of bombing of abortion clinics or killing doctors who are providers of abortion services. Or perhaps those who support the traditional understanding of family and oppose anything like gay marriage. And then there are even some more extreme movements within the Christian tradition, like the Christian identity movement or the Aryan Nations movement that says that ultimately the chosen people that God has chosen are white people and white people alone. Well, let me try to complexify a little bit by sharing with you just my own place in all this. Probably I would be classified as, by many in my own tradition, as either a religious extremist or a fundamentalist. I'm a conservative evangelical. I voted Republican most of the time. I am a strong friend and supporter of Israel. I'm pro-life, although I've never bombed an abortion clinic, never even demonstrated in front of one. I support the traditional view of marriage. And so in my own tradition, that would classify me as a religious extremist or a fundamentalist. But I'm going to tell you a couple of stories that will perhaps complexify that. Back in April of 2005, I was in Amman, Jordan, and I woke up one morning and I heard that quiet voice of God say, "I want you to build a bridge to the Muslim Brotherhood." So later that morning, I called my friend Jamal Halaby, who was the bureau chief for Associated Press in Amman, and I asked Jamal if he would line up a couple of meetings with Muslim Brotherhood leaders. Not only did he do it, but he went with me to translate. I remember the first one, at one point in the meeting, and he was a spokesman for the Muslim Brotherhood, he asked me, "Why are you here? What do you want?" I said, "Well, let me be honest." I said, "I don't want anything from you. I'm not here to invite you to anything. But the politics have made you and I enemies. And in my tradition, Jesus said that I'm supposed to go to my enemies. I'm supposed to learn to love my enemies. So that's why I'm here." And he could accept that. Now, that was the beginning of building a bridge. And for 4 years, I met with a couple of Muslim Brotherhood leaders. And quite honestly, there were times when I felt I was building the bridge to nowhere. But finally, in the fall of 2009, a big door opened up, and I found that I was meeting with all the top leadership of the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. And out of that came a joint initiative between the Patches Project and the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood to bring together evangelical Christian leaders from the United States with the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood. A year ago in January, we had the first gathering of that group. Now, here you have two groups that would be classified as extremists. Certainly, in many people's thinking, the Muslim Brotherhood as Islamists are considered extremists. Many of the evangelicals that we brought would be in the camp of being Christian Zionists, strong supporters of Israel. One of them was a former Republican congressman from Ohio, a couple of military types, academics, journalists, but in general, strong supporters of Israel. And yet these were the very people that the Brotherhood wanted to talk to. And it was incredible what happened in those 3 days that they were together. Now let me paint a further part of that picture. Last November, 2 members of the Jordanian Brotherhood and the 3 of us from the Patches Project flew to Cairo together. And there we went to meet with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood leaders to talk about this process of faith-based reconciliation and to invite them to be part of it. The Jordanian Muslim brothers did all the talking. By the way, you'll be interested to know that the leader of the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, he and I bonded immediately because we are both USC alums. I'm class of 72, he was class of 82. I'm sure that the alumni folks will be happy to know that he's fighting on for old SC in Egypt. Now, let me give you a bit of a different picture that may, again, complexify things. For 30 years, I was involved in the Episcopal Church in the conflict over human sexuality. I would have been on the side that advocated traditional marriage. And for the first 20 years, I was in a very strong role of advocacy, both on the local, regional, and the national level. But after about 20 years, I came to an interesting conclusion that nobody was convincing anybody of anything, and that at a certain point, we were going to have to learn how to live together. And over the last 10 years, I began to devote my work on the national level to working for reconciliation between the 2 sides, to find some way that we could coexist, that we could live together. Now, interesting, when one thinks about progressive Episcopalianism, one tends to think of inclusive, welcoming, open, tolerant. The reality underneath was far different, what I discovered. During the early years, the focus was what you would call big tent. Let's make room for all of us. You're not in favor of gay marriage? Fine. But let those of us who are be able to celebrate that. And I can live in chaos. I don't have to have everything neat and tidy. But what I found was that living together in the big tent was not the end of the conflict. At the end of the conflict was to win, to conquer, victory. And once the progressives accomplished their objective, the big tent began to shrink. And what we discovered was that the environment changed radically. And those who, once again, where there had been a big tent, were now made to feel ostracized. One doesn't have to carry a gun to be violent. You can use things like depositions from office, litigation over property, and public shaming and humiliation. Those are just as violent ways as someone carrying a gun. Now, one would never think of this as an extremist movement, and I wouldn't normally. But what I say is that when you're intolerant of the other, that sometimes that hides in strange places. Where I'm going to on all this is that at the end of the day, the root of religious extremism is hostility in the human heart. And that's something that all of us have to look at. Where is the hostility in our heart toward the other? And who is it that we define as the other? Now, the second point I said is that the answer is not what you think it is. Most people think that the answer to extremism is, one, to convert them, either convert them to my way of thinking or at least convert them to moderation, whatever moderation means. The second possible answer is to subjugate them, to marginalize them, to minimize their influence. The third answer is to try to simply do away with them. I remember at one point, one progressive leader said to me, "Let me be frank with you. We won, you lost. You either come around to our way of thinking or get out." Now, nobody maybe has said it quite that blunt, but that's how it is. Adjust to a new reality. Hardly the words of tolerance, hardly the words of inclusiveness. Now, many think that the answer is dialogue, interfaith dialogue, and I think in its own day, when dialogue emerged in the 20th century, I think it was a very important, groundbreaking thing that happened. And I think dialogue has had its place. But the hostilities of the 21st century have, in fact, I think, moved us beyond dialogue's ability to transform them. And something new is truly needed. I think the words of a friend of mine, a Kashmiri Muslim, a former militant commander, said it best. He said, "Brian, it's not enough to take the gun out of a man's hands. You have to deal with the ideas that cause him to pick up the gun in the first place. And to deal with those ideas, you have to present a more compelling idea, one that changes the human heart. And that's what you have in faith-based reconciliation." The real answer I've discovered working in some of the roughest neighborhoods in the world, some of the most intractable conflicts in the world, the answer is not gifted peacemakers. It's not coming up with creative solutions. I've heard every solution under the sun for the Middle East. But at the end of the day, it has to do with changing people's hearts and softening people's hearts. Michael and Tim and I have dedicated our lives to this work of faith-based reconciliation, which is really a process that begins with bringing antagonists together to allow God to soften people's hearts toward each other so that they can do constructive joint problem solving in the place of contentious advocacy. So, religious extremism is not always what you think it is, and the answer to it is not always what you think. It really, at the end of the day, the answer is not moderation. The answer is to become militants for reconciliation and peacemaking in our own situations. And the answer is allowing our hearts to be transformed toward those that we perceive to be the other. Thank you.